folks, Professor I here. Welcome to week 7. If you've made it this far, you are almost to the halfway mark. Yay you, it's awesome. We are beginning our second unit, poetry. You gotta serve somebody, as Bob Dylan said. In today's video, I want to go through that elements of poetry sheet with you, because it's very fundamental to your understanding. And then I want to go through the paper 2 assignment sheet with you as well and talk a little bit about the other assignments for this week and some that are coming up. So if you want to follow along with me with that elements of poetry, you can go to content up at the top of the page, and then in the left-hand toolbar, look for course documents. You'll have to hit load more, and then look for the elements of poetry. So with each of our units, 1, 2, and 3, we have the elements of fiction, now the elements of poetry, and with our last unit, we'll have the elements of drama. And a lot of the ideas from these 3 documents are the ones that are gonna come back and haunt you on that exam on literary terms that comes up at the end of the course. So as we're going through this document, as we did with the elements of fiction, I'll point out which ideas are going to be really important on that exam, and also we'll have a review, obviously, before we get to the point of the exam. So some people, when they hear that word poetry, it sort of strikes fear into their hearts, but do not be afraid, because it will be okay, I promise. Poetry is characterized by the presence of imagination, emotion, universal truth, and of course we saw that with fiction. Emotions and experiences that all humans can relate to, and sensory impression. Now that's important in fiction, but it's really important in a poem. It's expressed rhythmically and usually with an orderly arrangement of parts, and within itself it expresses a wholeness, a unity. It's written for the main purpose of providing aesthetic and emotional pleasure and or response from you, the reader, and to make us think about things that matter. So I give you there some well-known definitions by famous writers. I'm not going to ask you about any of those definitions, but I do like some of what the great writers had to say about it. So let's get to the basic elements. You see a lot of imagery in poetry. You'll see that in fiction as well, but a lot of it in poetry. So words that are calling on our senses in order to create a good image. And you know that if you connect a memory maybe with a scent or with a taste, something like that, then the memory sort of becomes much more real. So a good poem is going to set forth a very exact original image. Poems use analogies, so an extended comparison again. A lot of the same techniques that we saw in fiction. Personification. Think of Princess Fufu. I personify her and make her seem like a person, because she is one. She's in the other room. She can't hear me right now because she's sacked out. She's like totally just zonked out. She stays up all night and sleeps all day. She's a party animal, I guess. She plays the piano often about 2 or 3 in the morning. She walks across the keyboard and plays a little concerto for us just to entertain us. Personification, giving human-like traits to an animal or object. Animism, which is related to personification, but you're giving life to an inanimate object, like the fog comes on little cat feet, right? So apostrophe, now when we hear that word, we think of grammar. And placing an apostrophe to show ownership or possession, and it does mean that, but in poetry it also refers to the act of addressing someone who isn't there, someone who's either absent or non-human, and so that's apostrophe. Rhyme, we know that that's the repetition of similar or identical sounds, and so there are 2 kinds of rhyme. There's true rhyme, an exact rhyme like day and way. And then there's slant rhyme, and that's a close rhyme. It's not exact, but it sounds a lot alike. And those 2 terms will haunt you on that exam on literary terms. So move and love would be an example of a slant rhyme. They sort of sound alike, but they're not exactly alike. A true rhyme would be move and groove, or love and above. Does that make sense? And then we have internal rhymes, so words within a line in a poem that actually rhyme with each other. Often it's the words at the ends of lines that will rhyme, but sometimes even within one line, you'll have words that rhyme with each other. Alliteration, that's definitely a one that will haunt you on that exam. Repetition of the same sounds, I just did it, same sounds, at the beginning of words. So, for example, Langston Hughes' famous poem, A Dream Deferred. You hear the D sound repeated at the beginning of those words. That's alliteration. So that's a technique that a poet might use just to make the poem sound prettier and softer and more interesting to our ear, right? And then you have assonance. So that's the use of a similar internal vowel sound like scream and beach. Hear the E sound? Just a little technique that a writer might throw in. And consonants, similar internal consonant sounds like leaves and lives. So again, just little techniques that a poet might use to make the poem more pleasing. And then you have cacophony. This is like a harsh, non-harmonious sound produced by the use of hard consonants. Now, when I think of cacophony, I think of my little church where I grew up in East Ridge, right? So we had Brother Woody, who was the choir director, very sweet man, but did not really know anything about music at all, and didn't know how to direct, and that was okay because we didn't have a real choir who knew much of anything anyway, you know. So when he wanted to direct the singing, as we called it, he would do this. It was like he was washing an imaginary window, and he'd stamp his foot in rhythm. If he wanted you to go faster, he'd go like that. When you slow down, he'd go like this, right? So we had Eva Epperson, Miss Eva. She was our lead soprano in the choir, and as my father said, she couldn't carry a tune in a lard bucket, but she really tried. And she sang just about that much off key. Then we had a lady on the organ who was pretty good. She was a widow, and they called her the widow. And she'd been married a whole bunch of times, and she was a very heavy smoker with a deep smoker's voice. And then we had my Aunt Alice Marie on the piano. And my Aunt Alice Marie did not like to play minor chords because she felt that they were very depressing and boring. And she could read music, but she just didn't like them. So she wouldn't play them, which would make the widow very upset. And the widow had been known to let loose with some profanity against Aunt Alice Marie during the choir rehearsals, which then upset Brother Woody, you know, and so it was just like this vicious cycle. But you can imagine at Christmas with a song like We Three Kings with all the minor chords in the verses, the cacophony that ensued between the organ and the piano and Miss Eva and, right? Cacophony. Blech. Euphony is the opposite of cacophony. So that's language that sounds harmonious. And then I included onomatopoeia. That's so fun to say. Try it. Onomatopoeia. That's so fun. So that just means words that sound like their meanings, like hiss, bang, pop, boom, onomatopoeia. And there are many, many, many other techniques that poets use, but I've just listed a few here for you. So meter and rhythm are important in poetry. So we know what a syllable is, right? Any word or part of word produced in speech by a breath. So we know that an accented syllable is the syllable that's stressed. And in poetry, you use what looks like a diagonal mark to mark an accented syllable, and you use what looks like a lowercase u to mark an unaccented syllable. And so if we were in the classroom, I'd write on the board probably roses are red, violets are blue. And so I would mark above the words, the syllables that are accented with that little diagonal. Roses are red, violets are blue, right? And all the other words, I'd make the little lowercase u above them to show that they're unaccented. And we call that whole process scansion. So if I'm going to scan a poem, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to figure out first which syllables are accented, which are unaccented. And then I'm going to break it up into feet. So a foot in a poem is the basic rhythmic unit of verse. And usually it'll consist of one accented syllable and maybe one or two unaccented syllables. And the line consists of one or more feet, right? And scansion is just that process of figuring it out. So I won't ever ask you to scan a poem, but I will ask you what that word scansion means on that exam on literary terms. So there are different types of poetic feet. There's iambic, where the stress is on the last syllable, today. There's anapestic, intervene. You've got 3 syllables, stress on the third one. There's dactylic, yesterday. So 3 syllables, stress on the first one. And scansion is not an exact science, right? It's just one way of figuring out the rhythm of the poem. And so we might all scan the same poem and our scansion process might be a little bit different, but we probably would pretty much be on the same page. And also, this is super important to remember. Perfect regularity of rhythm is not necessarily a requirement in judging the quality of a poem. So you might have a little poem that just sounds just like this, and it has perfect rhythm, and it still might be a piece of crap, right? So bear that in mind. Symbolism. A symbol, as we know, is an image that stands in for something else, represents something else, and it can suggest 2 or more simultaneous levels of meaning. So there are all kinds of symbols that we'll see in writing and in poetry, universal. So the associations are commonplace enough that most people all over the world are going to get it. And you might see that with weather. So when we talk about a cloudy sky, you know, in any part of the world, that's going to represent maybe feeling sad. And then there are cultural symbols where the associations are common just to a particular culture or group. An example of that would be a flag. There are contextual symbols where the associations are deriving their meaning within the context of a specific work. So, for example, the apple in the Genesis story, right? And numbers have meaning in poetry. 0, it's never ending, so it could represent eternity. 1, unity, divinity. 2, marriage, you know, or conflict. 3, life and death, struggle, solution of conflict, and so on and so forth. Colors also have symbolic meaning. And so, as we've talked about before with connotations, the associations we make with words, the symbolic meaning of a color could be positive or it could be negative, right? So with white, we might think of white and it could represent innocence and purity and light. It could also represent ghost, paleness, death. Look at me, right? I used to pray that all my freckles would someday come together and I would have a tan, but no, it's my, plight to just go around looking like death for the rest of my life. Yellow, same thing. So it could represent the sun, wisdom, light, or cowardice. He's a yellow-bellied coward. Red, watch that one, watch it. It could represent blood or passion, war or temper, and so on and so forth. And then there are other common symbols like water, the sea, the rising or setting sun. The seasons of the year could parallel with a human life cycle. Spring representing new birth, summer the prime of life, autumn sort of adulthood, and then winter aging and death. There are Freudian symbols and concave objects sort of representing females, extended objects representing males, and that denotation connotation again, that's super important. You really need to be thinking about that when you're analyzing a poem. So the denotative meaning again is the word's literal dictionary definition, but the connotative meaning refers to all those associations the emotional overtones, the baggage, as it were, that that word would carry with it. And the very first task in figuring out a poem is to thoroughly consider every word and the connotative meanings of those words. And words can have multiple, even conflicting connotative meanings. We're going to talk some about structure and form in poetry, and there are several kinds of those. So there's narrative, and as you can imagine, that's focusing on action, on telling a story, and there are different kinds of narrative poems. Might be an epic poem, a ballad. Dramatic concentrates on dialogue or presenting a scene or a series of scenes like a dramatic monologue. A lyric poem is more about a preoccupation with emotion, ideas, the poet's state of mind. And then sonnet, and this will come back and haunt you on that exam later to come. A sonnet is made up of 14 lines of iambic pentameter, and there are two kinds of them, the Italian, which is also called the Petrarchan, and the English sonnet, which is called the Shakespearean. And we will be looking at a sonnet or two in our unit. So now let's take a quick look at the paper 2 assignment sheet. Let me take a moment and go over it with you. And to get to it, you would again go to content. You would go to major paper assignments and related materials in the left-hand toolbar, and then you would click on the paper 2 assignment sheet. So it's an explication of poetry, paper 2. When you hear that word explication, think explanation, because really that's what it is. You're going to explain a poem. And so you're going to explain and interpret it in order to demonstrate a clear understanding and interpretation of its details, its underlying meaning, its theme, right? The techniques that the poet used to produce meaning and content, and any other important aspect of that poem that is unique or significant. So you'll write a general explication of a poem that we're studying together in Unit 2, this unit on poetry. And the important dates, on Wednesday the 28th, that'll be our idea workshop day for paper 2, or week day for paper 2. You'll go to the assignments tab, you'll look for the idea worksheet, you'll follow the instructions there and upload before Wednesday the 28th. So that's getting you started, getting you thinking about what you might want to do. You can always change your mind, but it gets the ball rolling. And then Monday the 2nd of November, we'll have a pre-writing day for paper 2, which will take the place of a peer review. So you'll post in the week 11 pre-writing for paper 2 discussion board. And so you'll submit some things for that pre-writing day. First, you'll submit a pre-written introductory paragraph with your thesis at the very end and an outline with 3 main points. And I'll give you feedback on that, but you want to submit it before 11:59 p.m. on Monday night the 2nd. And then the final draft of paper 2 is due no later than 11:59 p.m. on Monday the 9th of November. And so after you've gotten feedback from me on the pre-writing materials, that intro with the thesis and the outline, then you'll submit that final draft through the assignments tab. And remember that 10 points get deducted from your paper 2 grade for every calendar day that that paper is late, including the day that it's due and weekends. I don't accept them at all after 5 days because they would be Fs. Specifics, the paper should be at least 3 full pages long. If you go over that, that's fine, but if you go under that, you're going to get points deducted. Typed, obviously, double-spaced in Times New Roman 12-point font. Very important, standard margins. So for this assignment, you only need to document your main source, the poem you're analyzing. I strongly encourage you to find a second source, though, that either offers some literary critique or analysis of that poem, or that maybe comments on a technique that you're seeing at work in that piece, because that will be helpful to you. But you must document and cite with quotes from your chosen poem. And you'll need to do that in the body of your paper, and then you'll need that separate works cited sheet at the very end. So your goal, again, is to write a careful explication or explanation of a poem of your choosing, and it must be a poem listed on our syllabus in this poetry unit that we're all reading together. So Unit 2 begins Monday the 5th of October. It ends the day that Paper 2 is due. You want to notice every technique the poet's using. Look back at that Elements of Poetry sheet for help, and pay a lot of attention to things like symbolism, sound and rhythm, internal and external form, which we're going to be talking about. And be sure to address the ways at some point in which this poem reveals some aspect of our class theme, which is enslavement. So think about these things as you're writing. Have I chosen a poem listed in Unit 2? Have I written a compelling thesis statement? So here's an example of a bad thesis. The poem Why Do We Sing by Mario Benedetti is very beautiful. Alrighty then, that tells us nothing, right? How and why is it beautiful? What's the theme? Why does it matter? Check your topic sentences to be sure you're making points of analysis rather than just summarizing what's happening in the poem. Does your introduction have a hook? Have you remembered poetry titles are placed in quotation marks, not in italics? The rule is that shorter works, smaller works, quotations, longer works, italics. Have you remembered to refer to the author by last name only after fully introducing him or her in your intro? Are you using literary present tense? Very important when you're talking about literature. So the rule is literature can be read again and again. And so therefore the stories, the characters just exist in perpetuity, right? So we use present tense to refer to the actions and characters. I would not, for example, say Benedetti used interesting sentence structure. I'd say uses in present tense. Are you using formal academic language in your writing? You want to avoid words like stuff. You want to avoid first person, I and me, second person, you and your, unless they're part of a quote. Do you have those correct in-text citations, line quotations, and or paraphrased ideas in MLA format? Do you have a works cited page? Have you been careful not to plagiarize? Have you included quotes from your chosen work? And notice that quoting from poetry is different than quoting from some other type of writing. So for example, I'm separating the lines with a diagonal. And look at the example that I've given you there under number 13. If those who are ours are left without an embrace, space, diagonal, space. Our motherhood is almost dead of sadness, space, diagonal, space. So every time I have a line break, I have a space, a diagonal, and another space. And then at the end, in my in-text citation, rather than putting the page number, I put the line number or numbers that I've just quoted from. And the reason that you don't see Benedetti's last name in that in-text citation is that he's mentioned in my sentence when I'm talking about the quote. And you can read the rest of the ideas there. And then I give you examples of a possible thesis and game plan using, in the first one, that Why Do We Sing by Benedetti. In the second one, Of the Threads That Connect the Stars by Martin Espada. And at the very end of the sheet, you'll see the TBR student learning outcomes to be evaluated in paper 2. So hopefully that helps to cement the ideas there about the elements of poetry and what you're expected to do in this paper. The other readings that you have for this week are Bob Dylan's song lyric, Gotta Serve Somebody. That's from my time, right? But Dylan was awesome. And that really goes along very strongly, the ideas in that song lyric, with our theme of enslavement. And then Barbie Doll by Marge Piercy. And then there's a little piece, Introduction to Literary Criticism. And it's just a little one-page document about literary criticism, what it is, what it does, etc. In this week's discussion board, you have Discovering Theme and Tone in Piercy's Barbie Doll, and you have Discovering the Speaker. So a couple of topics there in this week's board. And then next week, we're looking at a couple of poems, and we're going to be talking about setting in poetry, and you'll be taking quiz 3. So that's sort of looking ahead a bit. Thanks for your patience. Have a fabulous week, and I will see you soon.